Today, the 3rd of March, is World Hearing Day. According to the World Health Organization, more than 2.5 million people worldwide will develop a hearing problem, and more than half of them will need rehabilitative treatment over the next 10 years if these are not addressed on time. In South Africa, those challenges are only exacerbated by socioeconomic barriers. Under this year's theme of ear and hearing care for all, let's make it a reality, the South African Association of Audiologists and the South African Speech, Language and Hearing Association are on a mission to make sure the message is heard by all. Now, speaking on behalf of those organizations is Audiologist Mampho Dlulane, who joins us virtually from Gqeberha this evening. Mampho, thank you so much for your time this evening. Now, that's statistics from the World Health Organization saying that more than 2.5 million people worldwide will develop a hearing problem. Do we know what those numbers are here in South Africa?
I am so glad we're having this conversation this evening, mostly because, again, we don't talk about hearing care much. In South Africa, the numbers themselves do, I mean, when you look at it, it's 1 in 5 people currently that have a hearing loss. And in 2050, that number is expected to be at 1 in 4 people with hearing loss if we don't apply good listening habits, or good hearing habits, rather.
And those are really, really serious numbers. Now, you speak about, I hear you make the difference with saying people who will develop hearing problems. Do we then add to the number of people who are born with issues with hearing, either being deaf or hearing impaired? How do we differentiate between those two groupings?
It's when the hearing loss is acquired, it's when a person has or was born with hearing, and as well they develop, get older, then for some reason or the other, that then, or they end up with a hearing loss itself. So being born deaf is different in the sense that when you're born deaf, you don't have access to sound, and in essence you grow up learning sign language, which is again something we really need to get into as a country, because once a child is identified early, it means then we can know which mode of language we're using. Are we using total communication, which includes South African Sign Language and verbal speech, or are we using verbal spoken language only? And the only way to really get to that is early identification. And in South Africa, there's no streamlined, there's no law that says babies born in South Africa should get their hearing screened. And it's very, very important that we do, simply because that then means a child has better access with regards to educational options and also better independence, because if you've developed that South African Sign Language and you've got the vocabulary, I mean, you can go ahead and study, go ahead and work, and still be very independent.
And, we often have these conversations and we have to acknowledge our privilege in those conversations. I mean, I gave birth about 2 years ago, and one of the things that I was lax with was getting the audiologist test that the pediatrician had said, this needs to be done within 6 months, blah, blah, blah. But off I eventually did go to a hospital here in Sandton, made an appointment with a lovely audiologist that had the latest technology. Baba sat on my knee, they put the equipment in her ears, and you do have that little nervous moment as a new mum, of course. You watch the little machine work and the different colors, and she said, this is what we're looking for, and everything was A-okay. And off I went back home, knowing that that was one more tick in the newborn journey that I was able to tick. But that is a very far reality for the majority of South African mothers and young families and caregivers. What is on paper what most children in South Africa are getting in terms of ensuring that we know what their hearing situation is within the 6 months of their life? What are we getting from our clinics and from our public hospitals right now?
Not much, because even though there are audiologists in these different government institutions, a lot of audiologists are employed in tertiary institutions, secondary institutions, and for audiologists that are in the primary care level, oftentimes they don't have access to equipment. And these are also usually clinics that are far away, where even if the person is seen by the audiologist, the best that audiologist can do in that setting is simply just have a look in the ears, remove some wax if there's wax in the ear. So when it comes to the human resource, yes, audiologists are there, but oftentimes also our colleagues don't quite understand why we're necessary in primary healthcare. And that's simply so that children that are in clinics, children that are seen in smaller facilities actually have access to audiological care. And that early identification, again, is everything. Because, again, it just helps set, in essence, the tone for where about with communication we're going with that specific child.
Let's talk about the need for education at grassroots level, just about what services are available and about that early detection. I see the Western Cape government today released a statement to mark World Hearing Day, and they've said that their Department of Social Development has allocated over 59 million rand to 62 social service organizations and to provide support to people and children with disabilities, including hearing impairment. And their big aim here is trying to make sure enough communities know about the organizations that are out there to be able to support them. And again, back to my personal story, 40 years ago, my sister was born, and only when she turned 3 was her hearing impairment picked up. And even though I was very young at the time, I do remember the anxiety and the angst with my parents not knowing who to speak to, what support groups there are, what centers there were. We weren't in a major city, which of course, like you've said, is a major issue. And they come from a generation where you just speak about people being hard of hearing and off you went, speak a bit louder. Have we improved over those 40 years in making sure that especially our black and colored and of color communities are aware of these services that they can access, or are we still way behind in ensuring that people are educated about this kind of information at grassroots level?
We're definitely way behind. Mostly because, again, much like we don't get to talk to audiologists much, so we're really grateful for this platform as our audiology associations, because the only way to really educate people is to constantly, remind them that this is what audiologists do. And much like I say, because people don't know where to get help with regards to their hearing needs, oftentimes they then fall victim to needing help, but then they end up getting a hearing aid online somewhere, and that person is simply just trying to sell them something. So this education is so important, because it gives people insight into the real importance of hearing care. Because again, we use our hearing for everything. You are waking up in the morning, the birds are chirping, and that's your cue that, oh wait, it's morning. And as you orientate through space, it's also one of those, your ears, your hearing is letting you know, okay, there's a sound coming from there, there's a dangerous sound. We're using it in the classroom when we're listening to the class teacher. So that's also why it's so important to make sure that people are hearing optimally for their different listening situations, because when we're not, it creates communication barriers, it creates, isolation. For a lot of people, it makes them anxious. And because it's invisible, it's so hard to tell whether a person has a hearing loss or not. So much like you said with your sister, 3 years is a very long time.
Yep.
And had we had audiologists constantly educating, empowering the public so that they know how to make good decisions with regards to their hearing health, then it means we can identify all those people that need audiological support much sooner.
Do we need the education department to be more involved here? Because you're also dealing with a government institution that takes care of millions of children that go through their hands on a day-to-day basis. And in as much as we're talking about something that really is invisible unless teachers know what they should be looking out for, even though they already have so much on their plate, is it at school level perhaps that we can make interventions to try and pick up kids that are walking around with a hearing impairment that they don't know of, even before we start talking about the need for special education for children who are hearing impaired, hard of hearing, or indeed are deaf?
Definitely. We do definitely need a lot more audiologists within the educational sector. I do know in the Eastern Cape, we have a few audiologists within, the Department of Education supporting schools, supporting learners, but it's also too few for all these children, especially in more rural areas that are difficult to reach. So it's really one of those where even though we are few, we are still very, very keen to be employed in these different departments because the impact that the audiologist has is bigger than just, are you hearing, are you not hearing? Are you coping in the class so that you are hearing optimally, not getting tired trying to figure out what the teacher's saying? So we do definitely need a lot more audiologists in different departments. Healthcare, education, industrial, in essence, everyone needs an audiologist.
Indeed, we can only hope that your message gets across to as many people as possible. Thank you so much for your time this evening. That was Mampho Dlulane. She represents the South African Association of Audiologists and the South African Speech, Language and Hearing Association. She is an audiologist based in Gqeberha, and we speak to her on World Hearing Day.